This program was made possible by the generosity of those who have determined to hold fast to the true Roman Catholic faith. If you would like what Catholics believe to continue, please be ready to pledge financial support when you are asked later in the program.
This past summer has been marked by a great deal of attention on an encyclical by Paul VI called Humanae Vitae, in which the Church's opposition to artificial contraception was reaffirmed. Moreover, this was the 25th anniversary of this encyclical, and it occupied a great deal of attention from the media. John Paul II visited Denver for the World Youth Day, and his remarks centered many times on the Church's opposition to birth control. We'd like to discuss the reforms and artificial contraception. With me today is Father Clarence Kelly. Father Kelly is the spiritual director of St. Joseph's Novitiate, the Daughters of Mary, actually, a congregation of traditional Catholic sisters. I'm, of course, Julius Smetona, watching What Catholics Believe. Father Kelly, in the New York Times article, Peter Fels indicated that at most surveys indicate that at most 1 out of 10 Catholics support the Church's opposition to artificial contraception. And I might even add to that that if that figure is sound, as I think it is, it's, if anything, understated, because there is a bias since we have an aging population. So if you looked at people who are younger, that number might not be 9 out of 10, but 99 out of 100. What does that tell us?
I think it tells us what the Second Vatican Council produced. By their fruits you shall know them. When the Second Vatican Council was convened, John the 23rd was warned by the cardinals who are the members of the Roman Church that the situation in the world was such that it would be a disaster to have the council. When the council opened, John the 23rd attacked those cardinals, called them prophets of doom and gloom. And we see that their predictions were true. We see the fruit. In the beginning, there were a lot of people confused and mixed up about whether we should or should not have the council, whether the fruits would be good or bad. But it's for everybody to see. And what we see is the destruction of morality among Catholics, which followed upon the corruption of faith. Sometimes it's immorality that leads a person to lose their faith, but very often, especially when it affects large numbers of people, it works the other way. First you attack their faith, you corrupt their faith, then you corrupt their morals. This figure represents the corruption of the morals of Catholics. That Catholics no longer accept this infallible moral teaching of the Roman Catholic Church.
Well, what's even more striking, and people don't like to hear this kind of thing, it means 90% of Catholics are living in the state of mortal sin. If they have rejected this teaching and they're living according to their ideals, they are living in the state of mortal sin.
Well, the sin is actually, in a sense, worse than what you're saying for this reason. If a person recognizes that artificial contraception is intrinsically evil and is a very serious sin, and they break God's law, and they know that they're breaking God's law, they know they're committing a sin, that's one case. We're talking about something which is far worse than that. We're not simply talking about breaking God's law, we're talking about denying God's law. In other words, these people say, they don't simply say, we're practicing artificial contraception. They're saying, in effect, it's okay to do it. So to the sin itself, which is a very grave sin, is added the sin of the mind. In other words, the minds of these people reject this infallible teaching of the Church. So that figure represents not just the corruption of morals, it represents corruption of faith.
It's interesting, too, to note that in the coverage that John Paul II's visit had, was carried mostly by the New York Times, there was some misinformation or at least false impressions conveyed about the Church's teaching. There was an article by Alan Cowell of the New York Times, and he said, that since the publication of the Humanae Vitae encyclical 25 years ago that laid down the Church's opposition to artificial birth control. That's a very interesting phrase because it implies that there was nothing officially said about birth control until 1968. Is that the case?
Well, no, it's not the case, but it's sort of like the traditional Latin Mass. People talk about the traditional Mass as being the Tridentine Mass. The word Tridentine being derived from the word Trent, the Latin word for the city of Trent, where the council after the Protestant Reformation was held. And people think, well, the Mass, this traditional Mass,
only
began...
goes back to 1572 or whatever. Right.
Which, of course, is not so at all. Right. It goes back to the canon itself, anyway, to ancient times and even to apostolic times.
And even Pope St. Pius V said that any missal that was over 100 years old could still be, 200 could still be used. So much for the Great Reform.
Because that would be immemorial custom. But similarly, this writer who wrote this article probably, doesn't really know much about church history or church doctrine, although you would think if he wrote an article about the subject, he would do a little bit of research. But no, of course not. The contrary is true, that this teaching of the Church is not only something the Catholic Church has always taught, but in fact, it's something that the overwhelming majority of Protestants subscribed to in the not-too-distant past. When Pius XI published his encyclical on Christian marriage, the New York Times published an editorial praising the stand that was taken by Pius XI against artificial contraception. Protestants in this country were against artificial contraception. Laws were passed in the various states prohibiting the sale of things that would be used for artificial contraception. So not only is it not true with regard to the Catholic Church, but in point of fact, there was widespread opposition to artificial contraception in society, generally speaking, and this opposition was reflected in the laws. This is a moral teaching. It is based upon the natural law of God, as well as on sacred scripture in the Old Testament. Onan was struck dead by God because he practiced a form of birth control. Right. So it is the law of God which the Church has defended, has taught consistently. In fact, believe it or not, most people don't realize this, but Paul VI did irreparable harm to the teaching of the Catholic Church on artificial contraception. And his encyclical Humanae Vitae, which finally came out, the anticipation of the possibility of changing the teaching of the Church, and him giving the impression that that was possible, led a lot of people, a lot of Catholic people, into the practice of artificial contraception and the corruption of their belief.
Well, Stephen, I think there's one point I'd like you to expand upon. My understanding of Humanae Vitae is that Paul VI confounded the traditional teaching on the primary purpose of marriage. The primary purpose of marriage, of course, was the procreation of children. The comfort and the companionship was a secondary purpose. It seems that Paul VI placed the companionship and comfort almost on an equal footing, if not on a superior plane, to the procreation of children. And this is where then we get this encouragement of so-called natural family planning, which has as a consequence that the ideal family is of size 2, and if you have a family that is larger than 2, you're socially irresponsible.
Well, among liberal theologians, and of course in conformity with the humanistic spirit of the time, people began to shift the emphasis of their lives. Remember, there are two purposes which God created us. The first supreme purpose is His glory, and the second purpose is our eternal happiness. Both of those things are secured by the same thing. In other words, when we know, love, and serve God, we give Him glory. When we know, love, and serve God, we secure our eternal happiness. But in the order of creation, the primary purpose for creation is to give glory to God. The primary purpose for marriage is the procreation and the education of children, and ultimately the population of heaven. That's the point. The point is that men and women are given the responsibility to teach, to nurture, to raise, to encourage, to inspire their children to know God, to love God, to serve God, and to be happy with Him forever in heaven. But that supernatural perspective is alien to the spirit of the modern world. The spirit of the modern world is directed to this earth. And so people, in a certain sense, revolted at the thought that we would say the primary purpose of marriage is the procreation and education of children, and the secondary purpose of marriage is the love and the mutual comfort and so forth of the husband and the wife. And they revolted against that. They said, well, this is not right, you know. Let us at least put it on the same level. And of course, in some cases, they put the secondary ahead of the first, and then finally, what they did was they altogether abrogated the primary purpose, because people think that they can get married and do whatever they want. If they want to have children and not have children, that's perfectly permissible. But clearly, without any question, the primary purpose is, according to God's order, the procreation, education, nurturing, salvation of souls, of children. The secondary purpose is what we mentioned before.
What was very interesting in John Paul II's remarks, according as reported by Alan Cowell, the New York Times, he said, he, quote, he urged young people in particular to practice, quote, natural, unquote, birth control rather than using artificial methods. And then he went on and he said that John Paul II said, significant steps have been taken to promote natural family planning among those who wish to live their conjugal love according to the fullness of its truth. And then again, the article went on to say, thus the Church counsels that couples refrain from certain relations during ovulation. It seems to me that there's two things which are happening. Number one, John Paul II is saying, do not practice artificial contraception. Number two, he seems to be saying, practice natural family planning. What is the Church, the mind of the Church regarding natural planning, family planning, and the size of the family? And then the first question, going back, John Paul II, okay, he says don't use artificial contraception. He says that. What's he doing in the practical order? Because everyone's ignoring him.
Well, I think on the surface of it that it wouldn't be fair simply to put a negative interpretation on the words that were said.
Okay.
You know, I wouldn't say that that's fair, because one could always say and imply and really mean that what he was doing was not counseling necessary for people to take up the practice of natural family planning if they're having children. I think one could say that you have to give the benefit of the doubt, right, that what he was really doing was saying, look, you people out there who are using artificial contraception, if there's a sufficient reason to limit the size of your family, do not do it in a sinful way, in a moral way. Rather do it in a way which is not intrinsically evil or contrary to the law of God. I think you'd have to say that. Okay. You have to be real careful about reading into things that are said. But I would say in the practical order, that remarks like that, and the way they're played up in the press, are non-reflective of reality. And what I mean by that is this. Priests in the United States of America, bishops in the United States of America, they rule in parishes and in dioceses in which it is regularly, consistently, habitually taught that people are not obliged to adhere to the teaching of the Catholic Church on birth control. So the problem is not, first of all, the people. The problem is the bishops. The problem is the priests. The priests tell the people, follow your own conscience. The bishops put those priests in the parishes and are directly responsible for it. There's the problem. The problem is not that suddenly the people have revolted against the teaching of the church. The people have been scandalized. The people are the sheep. The shepherds have become wolves. They have twisted, they have perverted, they have sanctioned this conduct and this belief which is contrary to the teaching of the church. That's the problem. And for example, in all honesty, I mean, I don't want to, you know, put a wet blanket over the situation, but I think the thing to say to John Paul II is, look, your bishops, your priests are corrupting the faith of these people. If you have a problem with these people practicing artificial contraception, get rid of those priests. Get rid of those bishops who are corrupting them.
Well, he's appointing those bishops.
He is. That's the point.
He and Paul VI have probably appointed 95% of the active bishops in the world today, if
well,
not more.
that's what I'm saying. In other words, the way it comes across in the press is not a reflection of the real situation as it is. But in a certain sense, you know what it's like? It's like if you lived in a country where everybody was blind, and then one person saw a ray of light, that would be a major news event. So, in other words, the corruption is so far, has so permeated society and so-called Catholic institutions that when someone simply comes along and says, you know, don't use artificial contraception, it makes the headlines of the newspaper. That's not an indication of things being good. It's an indication of how really bad and corrupt things are.
You're watching What Catholics Stay on the Air. Father Kelly, there were some other very interesting remarks made by John Paul II in Denver. He acknowledged that the suffering, as he mentioned, and scandal caused by the sins of some ministers of the altar, and of course he's referring to cases which have become very, very spectacular and all too prevalent in today's society of you know, certain crimes of purity caused by priests. What are your feelings about those remarks?
I think it's too little, too late, and too much of a substitute for action. The situation as it exists today among the so-called Catholic clergy is an abomination. An abomination. It is an abomination and is causing incalculable harm to souls and to individual persons. When anyone commits a crime like that, when any adult would do something to a child, for example, that person conceivably should be subject to a capital offense. If a priest, a man who is supposed to represent God, commits a crime like that, he should be degraded. What I mean by that is, in the church, it's like drumming you out of the service. You know, the Marines have a procedure whereby they actually, you know, drum you out of the service. And in the church, there's a similar thing where a cleric is degraded, reduced to the lay state. And I know this will sound very, very strong for many people, but I personally believe that there should be a capital punishment for that crime. And I think in the case of priests who do such things, they should be degraded, they should be reduced to the lay state, and they should be handed over to the state. And in the Old Testament, it was a crime punished by death. But the horrible character of this is that a man who's supposed to represent God is committing this crime. And the simple fact of the matter is that the problem is homosexuality. And the homosexuals are invading the seminaries. Even some of the liberal priests, you know, like Father Andrew Greeley, has come out saying that there are so many in there that if a normal individual wants to become a priest and he goes to some of these seminaries, that he is discouraged. We know the experiences of Father John O'Connor, for example, among the Dominicans, who was kicked out of the Dominican order because of his opposition to homosexuality. The problem is homosexuality. The problem is the infiltration of these seminaries, and these things have to be cleared out. That's what he should do. If he's interested in these children, protecting these kids from these perverts who are destroying them, then what he has to do is he has to clean out the seminaries. And if he doesn't clean out the seminaries, he's responsible.
Well, you know, it's just even more incredible is that often these people who are accused and admit to such crimes, they might be rehabilitated for 6 months, and then they appear in a similar position in some other diocese within a year.
Because they have lost all sense of morality.
And the bishops are permitting this to happen, and he's aware of this.
And in some cases, they're not rehabilitated, by the way. That's a lot of nonsense. The only possible rehabilitation would come from, you know, the case of a person who truly repented of his sin and did penance for the rest of his life. You know, you conceivably could have a case like that where they would be confined someplace to monastery doing penance for the rest of their life. These people are not rehabilitated. It's absolutely absurd. It's like an alcoholic. Alcoholics are not cured. They are not cured. Anyone who thinks that an alcoholic is cured is a myth. The most an alcoholic can do is to stop drinking. You take someone who is an alcoholic who stops drinking, and then you put him to tend bar, and you expect him not to drink. It's unrealistic. These people are not cured. It's not essentially or primarily a psychological problem. I mean, many of these people do have psychological problems. It's essentially a problem of goodness, of decency, of truth, of honor, and of morality. And these people are without honor, they're without morality, they are corrupt, and they are corrupting others. And nothing will take care of this cancer except a radical surgery.
You know what you mentioned about your solutions.
And by the way, one other thing I would say, and horror. Horror. In other words,
it's a horrible crime.
The reaction should be one of horror. How could you do this? How can we tolerate you? How can we put up with this? But it's not. It's like, oh, this man has a problem. Let's send him to some rehabilitation center for $25,000 program, and then bring him back and ask the psychiatrist down there if he's cured. And the psychiatrist says he's cured, and we'll send him out to do more harm. There is no righteous indignation toward this monstrous crime. And when people become indifferent, then indifference rules and reigns and has its way, and the devil has his hand in all these things.
You know, the treatment of these individuals is not different than, say, for instance, a bus driver, a school bus driver became an alcoholic, and he was in a stupor and caused an accident, and some children were killed as a result of his irresponsibility, and say he was sent to a drug and alcohol rehabilitation center for 6 months, and they said he was cured. What would the parents think if he was back on that bus, or not on that bus, but a different bus? Mm-hmm. And this is worse because these people are attacking souls, not bodies.
They would be horrified, and that's why Catholic people are horrified. Mm-hmm. People can't believe that these bishops would take someone who has committed such a horrible crime and put them back in a place where they can do further damage. People are horrified.
And even though you mentioned your remarks would sound very harsh, how did St. Pius V, how would he have treated something like this? How did he treat something like this?
It's just an unspeakable crime. Right. It's just an unspeakable crime. We're not talking about, you know, the case of a person who has, you know, a struggle, who's trying to do good, who avoids the occasions of sin, who does not expose himself to danger, who knows it's wrong. We're talking about a society which sanctions, which approves, which puts, you know, a seal of authority on perversion. The President of the United States, the President of the United States sanctions perversion. It is only natural that the people who are like that will think they have a free hand. Mm-hmm. I was talking to someone just yesterday who is a fire marshal in a city on the East Coast who told me about his encounters with police. The police are telling him that there are clergymen here and clergymen there who are involved in the most horrible things you can imagine, and that it is widespread, and it's going to get worse because the seminaries are infiltrated by these people. They're infiltrated. We're talking about, in some instances, perhaps 50% of the seminarians. There's a seminary that someone told me about not too long ago. It's supposed to be a conservative seminary, conservative-type seminary. One of the seminarians told me that 25% of the seminarians are homosexuals.
Well, you know, too, just not to belabor this point, but what is going to be the effect on the Catholic Church in the future as a result of this? How will anyone take the priests seriously if, as this goes on, and the damage that this is going to cause?
It's absolutely terrible when you think of the fact that it is becoming a shame to wear a Roman collar, that you almost have to be embarrassed. Again, I was talking to someone else in Utica, New York, and this fellow was a Lutheran, a nice fellow, who didn't mean you know, any harm or anything like that, who passed a remark to me. He said, you know, in the light of what John Paul II said, you know, in the light of the situation, that he was surprised that he would see anyone in a Roman collar.
That's true.
And he didn't mean it in a cutting way. He meant it in a slightly joking way, but there's a certain truth to it.
So really, I mean,
it's terrible. The damage to the church is unspeakable.
The remarks, again, compared to the enormity of the crime, are almost window dressing. They're lacking in substance and resolve and action.
Right, and if something is not done, that conveys to the people the impression that it's really not so bad.
That's right. That's right.
Like
Father,
abortion.
Last question. In the article that preceded John Paul II's visit to Denver, there was an article which we alluded to earlier by Peter Steinfels. He contrasted Catholic beliefs with Protestant beliefs after the Council and before the Council. And for instance, one of the questions was on purity before marriage. And Catholics were much stronger on that question than Protestants before the Council. Oh, yeah. Now they're much weaker. What do you attribute this to?
I attribute it to Vatican II, and I attribute it to reforms that have taken place since Vatican II, the corruption of faith, the corruption of worship, and the corruption of morality.
This has been What Catholics